Hi everybody, thanks for watching Tim's Vinyl Confessions. I'm Tim Derling, got another episode for you this week. This one's actually kind of a book review, and in that I'm going to try to not give any spoilers out, but just be advised that I am going to be talking about stuff that's in the book. And I'll show you which book I'm talking about. It's this, Ted Templeman, A Platinum Producer's Life in Music. Written, well basically it's Ted Templeman's words as told to Greg Renoff, and Greg is a writer of a fantastic book called Van Halen Rising, which if you're a Van Halen fan and have not read, I can't recommend it enough. It's a great look at their early career, and I don't mean from their first album, I mean everything pre their first album. I'm talking starting way back in 1973 and the events leading up to the release of their first album in 1978. It's in-depth, it is well researched, and it's well worth the money if you're a Van Halen fan. And Van Halen fans will find much to like about this. As a matter of fact, this grew out of Greg's research for Van Halen Rising, because in doing that book, inevitably he ended up talking to Ted Templeman. And Ted Templeman, if you're a Van Halen fan, you should know the name. He produced his Van Halen related catalog goes pretty deep. It goes all the way back to '73 when he produced the first two Montrose albums, the two that Sammy Hagar sang on. He produced the first four Van Halen albums, so the first one all the way up through 1984. He produced Sammy Hagar's most successful solo album, VOA, and then to kind of tie it all full circle, he came back in '91 to co-produce the my personal favorite, For an Awful Carnal Knowledge album, and he also produced David Lee Roth's Crazy from the Heat and Eat 'Em and Smile. So his relationship with those guys runs very, very deep. However, that's not the focus, that's not the main focus of this book. This is about his entire career. It starts out with his early upbringing, but it really gets going in the mid to late 60s with his musical career, because before he was a producer, he was a member of a group called Harper's Bazaar, and they're best known for a cover of Simon and Garfunkel's 59th Street Bridge song, Feeling Groovy. That was their claim to fame, and so for a couple of years, he was, that's what he was known for. And of course, they were signed to Warner Brothers Records. And he ended up, through steps that are very well detailed in this book, ending up wanting to be a producer and not necessarily a musician, definitely not a touring musician. So little by little, he worked his way up the ranks in Warner Brothers to the point where in the early 1970s, he ended up producing albums by Little Feat, Captain Beefheart, who's like a cult artist, and his claim to fame, what really got him on the map as a producer, was producing the Doobie Brothers. It took a couple of albums before they started to hit it big, but once they did, he became a staff producer and more in demand. So it takes about halfway, really honestly halfway through the book before it gets to the Van Halen stuff, but by then it is a fascinating look at the music business, the behind the scenes music business in the 1960s and 70s, and really all the way through into the 90s, when unfortunately he was unceremoniously fired from Warner Brothers after being at the helm for several big selling albums, including several big selling Diamond albums. But if you're a rock fan like me, Van Halen is obviously the group, or the associated group, he's best known for producing. And we've heard the story of him getting discovered at the Starwood through many different sources, David Lee Roth's book, and other books on the subject. This is from his point of view. It talks about his first impressions of all the guys in the band. And I'm not going to tell you what it is, but it confirms something that I always thought was just a rumor about who he thought should be singing for Van Halen in the beginning. And you can probably guess what I'm talking about there, but his opinion on that changed, and it goes into a lot of detail about working on each of the Van Halen albums, in between working on albums by artists like Carly Simon and Nicolette Larson and other people like that. It's really, I found it really interesting, really compelling. It was hard to put down, and it talked about the deterioration that happened not only with his relationship between the band, his relationship with his longtime engineer, Don Landy, who continued to work with Van Halen post 1984, and it talked about how Eddie built his own studio, 5150, and of course the split and Sammy joining and his thoughts and all that, some of which I was quite surprised by to find out. So I'm not going to get into much detail because I don't want to give any spoilers away. It's really, really well written. Ted's very well spoken. He strikes me as just a very mild-mannered, serious guy when it comes to music. Not that he didn't have a sense of humor, certainly, but seems to have kept his head on straight as far as family goes, although he obviously spent a lot of time away as a famous producer. It's a really, really worthwhile read. If you're a fan of Van Halen and the music business in general, it's hard not to recommend it. There's other cool stories in there. He produced one of my favorite overlooked Aerosmith albums, Done with Mirrors, their first album for Geffen, which was the precursor to their big comeback, because it was Permanent Vacation, the next one that brought them back into the spotlight. That and the Run DMC collaboration. Unfortunately, Done with Mirrors didn't do as well as anybody had hoped, but I still think it's a really good album for songs, and I think it's a really well-produced album too. It also talks about how he came to work with one of my favorite bands, Honeymoon Suite, on their third album, Racing After Midnight. I wondered if that would get a mention in there, and it did. Talks a lot about the formation of Dave's first solo band, that great band with Steve Vai and Billy Sheehan and Greg Bichadet. About the one album it didn't talk about that he produced. Now, I may have missed it, but I didn't see any mention of him producing Cheap Trick's Woke Up With a Monster, which came out in 1994. It was their only album for Warner Brothers. It didn't do very well, although it's got some good songs on it. And it kind of ends on a downer note as far as his career because, knowing what I know about the music industry, Sammy talks about it in his book a lot, the corporate shakeups that happened at Warner Brothers that led to a lot of key people and a lot of longtime people being let go or their positions changing. But it does end on a positive note about him sort of coming full circle, and he worked with the Doobie Brothers one more time. If you're looking for a good read and you're into hard rock, rock and roll, even though really Van Halen is about the heaviest thing he ever produced, I recommend this book, Ted Templeman, A Platinum Producer's Life and Music as Told to Greg Renoff. And if you don't have it, get Van Halen Rising too. That's my 2 cents on this book. Check it out. Thanks for watching this edition of Tim's Final Confessions.